everyone. My name is Skip Stewart. I'm with Baptist Memorial Healthcare, and I have the honor and privilege of introducing Dr. William Harvey. Not only is he very passionate about Kata, he's a plant manager, but I think the most important thing to me, he's a veteran of the United States Marines. So everyone please give it up for Dr. Harvey.
Good morning. I succeeded in getting up the steps. That was frankly the most nervous portion of the day. So over the next 2 days, we're going to hear a lot about the micro side of Kata, and that's very important for many of the reasons we all know. Today I want to take a chance to go from the micro and talk the macro. So how many of you have ever deployed Kata like you're the first person to take it in an organization? By show of hands. How many of you would like a do-over? Me too. So I went through this process a few years ago and learned quite a few hard lessons. And then an opportunity came up that I might be able to go research some stuff. And as I began that research, the thing I thought about is, man, this is so new. And I thank Mike Rother for giving me a lot of stress, because as I was going through that process, my instructors kept telling me, go research it. So there really isn't much. It's 2009. There's not a lot out there. So events like this today, I hope to contribute to that, and in future years come back and be able to hear how this informs that practice. So I want to talk what I think is a very important piece, which is a link to cognitive development, which I'll position today as your job as coach, and talk about personality when you're talking about who do you pick to go first. So you'll hear over the next couple of days about shepherding groups from Skip and his team. You'll hear about that in Europe later this year. You'll hear Brandon Brown talk about that with the work he and Skip are doing together. This is that portion of that conversation that I want to step with. So I'm going to talk deployment, execution, and sustainment. And not surprisingly, being only around 10 years, there's not a whole lot of how do you sustain it yet. So that's something that was a key lesson learned for me and the group as we went through. So my link to Kata comes from a few different ways. So I was a practitioner. Like many, I started as a learner, became a coach, and then a second coach, and deployed at my organization. Deployed as a plant manager. So made this a routine. And in I'd say a very humorous way, as the organization had a major challenge, here are 3 people walking through a plant that literally caught on fire, and we couldn't run for 45 days, and I was out with my Kata storyboard trying to solve the problems to get the plant started. I'm also a researcher, so I'm fascinated by stuff. And as I talk in a moment about my individual moment, that's what spurred the conversation, the research that I went through. Then lastly, I get a chance to use Kata in the classroom in a different way. I teach at the University of Cincinnati, Claremont College, and we get a chance to use this for supervision. And it's one of those things at my organization right now, we're taking Kata away from CI and making it bigger as an organizational thing. There's some links that I won't talk today, but I will share with you privately if you so care, that this is something that's bigger. So from a supervisory perspective, how do we engage? Oscar just shared a great example of how you can do that every single day in every conversation. So learning to go beyond the Kata through practice is going to be very helpful, because you can change those questions and get people to take action. So how many of you had a moment where you realized that this Kata thing wasn't just a PDCA cycle, and you realized something special was occurring? By show of hands, because I got to imagine that's why many people are here. So my moment came after, I would say, traditional training. Green belt, black belt, master black belt. You did all this lean stuff. And then 2 years later, I was finally ready to go. I could go out and practice this stuff. But then I had to go back to the books and figure out what I didn't remember from that training from 2 years ago. And a very unique thing happened. We're going through the cycles. A team member who's a learner, after 2 weeks, comes to me and says, I want to be a coach. Like, that's cool. Second person comes up. The third person comes out of 7 that we selected to be our individual learners. And then in a very, very short time, I saw people out practicing Kata. And in my individual story, there were 10 problems that we attempted to solve. 7 of them were solved within the first month, and the other 3 required some advanced engineering support. But what it did for me was change the dynamic to all this, I would say, terminology of let's train people with all this technology, let's teach them the tools and get out there. And then I started to say, man, is this the key to leadership development? And I heard that today. So that was, frankly, the reason I wanted to go research this stuff. I said, we already picked good people to be learners. Those learners became effective coaches. And therefore, is that the link to leadership? So like a lot of researchers, I was wildly disappointed when I went through the process and I did not find that answer. But I found a gem in quite a few different ways. So, in the briefest of ways, I had 12 really awesome people that shared their stories with me from a Kata perspective. So what I'm getting ready to present is their idea, not my idea. It's my interpretation of that. There are a few key points I'll link to those things that are cognitive development and personality. And I encourage you to talk afterwards. And I know Sylvain has a lot of stuff that he's already shared yesterday at the meetup with information to go look at. I'll post some stuff there through Sylvain just so we can get this out into the community. But what I did was ask a more fundamental question about what is success, and then more importantly, why? Like, why Kata? I wasn't going to be happy just understanding the technical and practical details of let's go do this tomorrow at a new deployment. So, let's talk deployment best practices. There are 8 that came out of the research. The first, the advanced group associate selection appears make or break. And by this, I would say you must get this right. If you do not get this right, don't move forward. The second one, executive leadership must participate in advanced group. And you may be curious why I underlined participate. Of the people that I interviewed, 11 out of the 12 said they must participate, not just champion. So often we hear about executive support. That is not enough. They must be in that advanced group. If you want to have the most success, that kept coming back in the conversation. We're going back and forth in the research. The next one, key point. Advanced group associate selection is akin to hiring. So Billy mentions people. I don't know his full details, but if he's on the HR side, like I love on the people side, there's already 60, 70, 80 years of research that says your advanced group can be informed by the practice that HR has been doing for the last 50, 60 years. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then do not select people who need convinced. And this might not seem like an obvious thing, but Billy may be my leader. And I say I want Billy to lead this for me, but Billy may not be the best person. So we must be patient as Kata practitioners, and particularly those getting ready to launch an initiative. If no Kata expert, hire an expert to coach your coaches. And I make a key point here. The people that I shared said, let's not do the old model of CI where somebody comes in and does the work for us. The goal is to make sure that these team members come in and coach the coaches. So that advanced group, hire an expert. Go find somebody if you don't understand this. Do not start coaching without some expert assistance. The piece I'd share, many of the most successful coaches, and I think the problem that we're faced with as a group is we're not very good coaches, because I keep hearing that in the Kata community. And that's what we're working on. How do we develop those skills? I had the, I would say, fortunate experience of reading Mike's book a few years ago. I put it down and I was working on 2 personal development goals. One was learning and one was coaching. So I got to those 2 things before I really understood Kata at the depth I do today. That helped inform the practice as a coach, and I think this is where the value is. So find an expert coach. Bring them in, coach your coaches, and as soon as you have that, I would say, self-sufficiency, let the people inside the organization continue that coaching, and only bring in supplemental help, but do not have them there for 15, 20 years doing all the coaching cycles for you. Executive team must clearly articulate vision, so learner practitioners can align target conditions. This is something that I hear a lot about, and in a recent example, my CEO just sent out a message that said he has to do a much better job communicating strategy to the tactics of everyday operations. This is something that came out in the research. Let's talk about that more. What am I working toward? Do I clearly understand the goal? Why is that important? So please do work with the executive team to communicate that more clearly. Start small. So yesterday at the meetup, I heard 13 storyboards at once, and my heart just stopped beating for a second, because I thought, man, that is not what I'm hearing from the researchers, or I would say the practitioners who inform the research. So when I say start small, the information that was shared with me is pick a cell, pick a hospital wing, pick a department, pick a few people. Don't go beyond that until the time is right. And then lastly, follow the starter kata in the earliest stages. I do agree with Oscar's comment. Do learn to change the questions as you go through the process. But in the beginning, follow that starter kata every single day so people can begin to have some consistency in that routine. Because if each day the questions change, there can be a lot of stress for a lot of different reasons for the learner. Then obviously to the point of, I would say, a more engaging conversation, by the time you can put the coaching card in your back pocket, you're going to be in a much better place. From an execution perspective, practice deliberately, we've all heard. to establish discipline necessary to support cultural transformation or cultural reinforcement. And I would tell you that this was a really cool point for me because I love culture. Edgar Schein is one of my favorite guys in the world to read from MIT. And Toyota is very deliberate in who they keep. They try to keep people along, but then eventually they'll just say, you've got to go. Same thing with Kata. If your executives don't get it, kick them out. If your advanced group doesn't get it, kick them out after the support. But if you keep them, they may not be able to make the change I'm going to talk about in a moment. Expand slowly. So if I say start small, go as those coaches can go. Transmitting from, I would say, the research to my world, I screwed up because I said, this is really fast. We can do this. And after about the first month, I was scratching my head like, man, I cannot do any of my normal day work. So I do encourage you guys to think about that. Start with 2 coaches or 2 learners, maybe 3, but don't go over 3 because you'll stress out like I did per coach, and it just made work very, very challenging. From a sustainment point, I shared with you there's not a whole lot here, but the group did share. Incorporate what you learn from Kata, from the coaches and practitioners, bring it back to the classroom to inform new people as you're going through the training session. And then lastly, after Kataing the Kata, share with new learners. So as you continue to develop your cycles, I heard a great example yesterday from Michael Kasten about what they're doing in the construction world. That is a great example of Kataing the Kata. What do we need to change? What works for us? So one thing I caution anybody to do is not be dogmatic with Kata. Start there, but let it grow to what your organization needs. So then there's this pause, going to the next thing. I want to share, there's a lot of stuff that happened in between, but I want to get to the 2 things that really drove me. I study philosophy, philosopher at heart, so people ask me, like, what would you do? I said I would just sit around and talk about things, big ideas. And those big ideas come out in something called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. And that study of knowledge brings me to where I want to talk next, which is cognitive development. So I'm in a position that while you go through the kata, it's not important enough just to solve a goal. It's to advance a learner from one state of mind to a further state of mind, and not every coach will be equal in this. And I want to propose a 4-stage model. There's this idea that the world is all right or all wrong. Then the world becomes of multiple perspectives. And then eventually it becomes relative. So how do I see the picture? And then lastly, what informs the way in which I see the world? From a dualism standpoint, color inside the lines. Don't color outside the lines. Think inside the box. That answer's wrong. That answer's right. That's how we educate our children. There are very, very few times where a child can go outside the lines, but they can't learn. So they begin to associate something that's pretty dangerous in my mind. Authority are our parents, our teachers, our police, the law. They begin to, I would say, struggle with this concept. How do I only go left, right, center? There's only one path. So they struggle with this idea of where to go next. And lastly, they start to associate knowledge with those 4 groups I just mentioned. And that, to me, can be pretty dangerous thinking. Then as people begin to progress, there's this idea of multiplicity. So they start to reject their parents, start to reject the police and the teachers, and this happens around teenage years. So I've got my 14-year-old and a 13-year-old now, so that's all coming very, very true for me. And then they do the best thing we do, which is what I did. We went to our friends. And we started to associate our friends with the right idea, our authority. And then this really crazy idea happens. School informs our thought. Education is the god of the world, in a sense. This is where everything is right and everything is wrong. At this point, a child has not been able yet to think for themselves. And as they age, and as they progress through college, they start to figure out some things, which are, question 1 might have 2 right answers. Question 2 is pretty straightforward, so they'll put these answers that they kind of fit. And then, as we continue this idea, it's about people, each perspective. Each of us have the right answer. And then what many people begin to realize is there's an option E. And option E is the right answer, or the best answer in each of these. However, it's informed by the context in which we view the world. So yesterday, Panos had mentioned something around the idea of ideas or thinking driving behaviors, and there was a really good discussion. My opinion is this context matters. And the coach has to figure out, why does the person think that way? Not simply just go through the coaching kata. That's easy. You can train anybody that's, you could say at least read at an 8th grade level to do that. But to get to the fundamental level underneath this, you must understand what drives their thinking. So I've got this idea, and I want to share with you where it really comes out of. It was college research. So as we go from left to right, freshmen to juniors and seniors at that relativistic level, they regress without structure. So if in your own practice you think I graduated college and I went backwards, that's what's happening here. And until graduate school, before people begin to start being asked to think on their own, because you're still transitioning from multiple choice to what do you think, this is that piece in which I believe the coach is guiding the student through, or the learner through. So if we look at our demographics within our workforce, you probably see different styles of thinking based on the type of industry you work. I work primarily with individuals that didn't graduate, or rather graduate high school, but haven't had any college. So I have to think about this differently in which way they see the world. Differently when I'm engaging the executive team, who most often have graduate degrees, and I've got to figure out where are they at, what's informing their process. Green button, go. So here's my kata slide, and I'm going to link it to something I think is part of the answer. And this is a key point, and I'm hopeful in future KataCon years we get to hear more about this concept. And that, if this thing will progress for me, motivational interviewing is the thing I want to talk about very, very briefly. So a few years back, Mark Graben talks to a gentleman named Samuel Saleh. Samuel Saleh is talking to me, and he says, have you heard of this idea of motivational interviewing? I said, no. What is it? He described it, and I thought, I wonder what this is. So what I found out after some research, and I would tell you this is very exciting research. You have to read through like 500 pages to get the 3 morsels I'm getting ready to tell you. So don't do that. It comes out of clinical psychology. So last night we heard conversations about, is it therapy or is it coaching? What I found with motivational interviewing is this very, very interesting idea. I learned it through different research, and then this helped me even further. But I'd like you to think of 0 being your opinion, or rather 100 being your opinion, and 0 being somebody who's polar opposite. And I want to think about the most divisive issue you can come to think of. If you think about approaching somebody in a sense of, I want you to get to 100, and you do it in a way in which you refute their idea, you won't get them to take a step. So you have a person who wants to change something about their behavior, but they don't know yet how. And this motivational interviewing, informed by clinical psychology, says you can bring people one step closer by talking about the positives of change. And the way in which I'd like you to think about this, think of an individual who's suffering from addiction, because that's really where it came from. If I think about addiction as a bad thing, and I talk about why do you do drugs or alcohol, etc., it's not going to get the thing I want, they're just going to retreat. So what I can do at this point is say, well, what do you do, or what do you enjoy doing most? And they'll say, I love hanging out with family. An opportunity and a gem is to talk about that positive change. Don't talk about the negative. As a coach, if you do that, you'll get them stuck further and further on their idea. So as we're going through the coaching kata and going from 0 to 100, whatever 100 is in this world, consider this as an idea. And I think as you learn more about motivational interviewing and it informs your practice, this is where coaching will become very, very, very helpful for each of us. So I'm going to go into personality, which is I would say a very fun place, and it's a little bit different than philosophy because there's a lot of data that backs up what I'm getting ready to share. So how many of you know the Big 5 personality model by show of hands so I can go appropriate depth? Not very many, which is awesome, so I can explain it a little bit more lengthy. There are 5 things that really inform psychological research in personality. And what happens with psychology is they say we've got to use statistics. So if you're a black belt, a green belt, or you've used some Six Sigma stuff, it most likely came out of this research at some point. And the Big 5 are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is often the inverse is emotional stability. Openness to experience and conscientiousness is what I want to talk to you about most. And openness to experience is how likely is somebody to approach a new idea. So the link I'd like you to think is that learning zone. How likely are they willing to take a step that is unfamiliar? How likely are they going to be to try a new thing, whether that's a food and a cultural transformation like kata, or some brand new idea from a governmental perspective. Conscientiousness, many people associate it with work ethic, and that is true. So basically, how hard do you work, and how orderly are you in your world? Extroversion is probably the most common that people know. Either you're an introvert, an extrovert, or somewhere in between as an ambivert. Agreeableness is essentially how likely are you to agree with an idea. And the psychology informs us, or the research informs us rather, that men are less agreeable than women. Who agrees with that idea? Yeah, right, exactly. So there are very important statistical shifts and things to evaluate as you guys look at who could be in your advanced group. And then neuroticism or emotional stability, how stable is somebody with their behavior? It's really straightforward in that mind. But openness and conscientiousness, I was talking to one of my instructors, and he shared something. He said, Kata is very rigid. And I said, but it's not rigid because none of the answers are the same. So it put this paradox forward for me that I brought into this presentation. So if I think about openness to experience, the two areas, links to intelligence and curiosity. So Panos, wherever he's hanging out, talked about this late last night. And there is no direct link between intelligence, curiosity, and openness to experience, but it's very, very closely linked, I should say. So that's one version of it. And then when open, it's a little bit different. But if I look at intelligence, can they grasp new information, particularly the ambiguous stuff, quickly? Because the more ambiguous that information is, the more difficult is the process. You could see this by handling a lot of information. You could see this in complex problem solving, so what are their hobbies? And that they think quickly. So people that respond either quantitatively or qualitatively will be able to adjust a little bit differently here. And then from an openness perspective, they reflect on past experiences. So when you're engaging people, do they talk about their trips? Do they talk about the really cool stuff that they've just learned from their personal journeys? And are they seeking novel and new experiences? Do they try new places? Do they travel around the world? And do they share their creativity with the world? So I think of that in the sense of the arts. Does somebody create something and share it with the world, not knowing the feedback they'll receive? But the drive for many of these people is to put that out into the world. And then conscientiousness, I'm not going to talk about work ethic. I just want to talk about orderliness. They like order and routine. They prefer schedules. They follow the rules. They honor their commitments, and they focus. So by show of hands, just as an instant feedback for me, if you have somebody who has both of these to some degree that's more than average, do you think we'll have a better Kata learner, Kata practitioner, coach, etc.? That's like half. That's good news. At least I'm onto something maybe that is worth researching further. So if you're looking for how do you find these people, and I do say coach, not just the advanced group here, find people that are comfortable going above and beyond their comfort zone. Travel to many diverse locations. So if you hear of a world traveler, this is somebody that might make a good coach. And it's not necessarily something you might think of when you're looking for who might want to be a coach. Associate with diverse friends. So what do they do? Who do they hang out with? This is very important in my perspective to engage them more. Are they imaginative? Do they think outside the box? Are they creative? Are they curious? And do they have non-traditional values? So if they challenge the status quo, this is somebody who's likely more open. In conscientiousness, besides the work ethic thing, they seek responsibility. They're very goal-oriented. You can see that they're on time to meetings. You can see that they're very effective in their planning. You can see that they organize their personal spaces. So very quickly I can see an office and go, I wonder how organized this person's going to be. They come into a meeting late. That may not be the person I want to select, particularly if I'm supposed to use these individuals as the models for the new thing. And if they act deliberately and resist impulse, and if they pay attention to details, they may very well be an effective coach. So, my dissertation is available for anybody that wants to read it, but please don't do that. I have a presentation that's a little bit more in depth just because of time. I can't go into everything today, and I'm glad to share that with you. There's a LinkedIn, I would say, connection or the hyperlink there. I'll be available to answer any questions. But my hope and what I leave people with today, if you think about motivational interviewing and you think about who do I select for coaches, how does other stuff from different practice inform that research? And I think that's a very, very important piece for us as we move forward as a community, getting this right at the very, very beginning. So do I have any questions about this stuff? Because my friend Melanie in the back, who's with me today, tells me I give a lot of information too fast, and then I leave a lot of questions unanswered. So does anyone have any questions? So either hit it out of the park or everybody's confused. So we go with confused, and I need to answer differently next time.
So just the origin of the cognitive development, basically. Where'd that come from?
Come from a gentleman named William Perry, who is not the football player. So when you guys type into Google and look this up, it's William Perry Theory on Cognitive Development, or often referred to as the Theory of Ethical Development. It comes out of Harvard research.
Is there a, is this on? It should be, yes. Is this, okay. Is there any kind of a profiling kind of exercise that you can take people through to get some sense as to where they fall in those criteria?
It's really, so for the, well, let me ask, for the personality side or the ethical side, or the development side? The cognitive side, Michael? So the way in which I do this is really just ask questions, understand where they think, and I think a lot of this comes out in the way in which they speak. So if I use something very easy, you know, that political group isn't like me. I oppose that political group, and they're not open. That's a place to tell me, at least in that moment, they're very, very isolated in their thinking. Equally, it's not an all or none kind of situation, so in many ways, people are going to be much further along in certain areas. So to me, it's really understanding how does the person think in the moment. And as a coach, all you're trying to do is get them to see maybe there's one more idea. And a specific example, I had a person I'm mentoring on the side. He has a job offer coming, and then he said to me, William, I think it's just not real. They have asked me to fill out an application. I said, well, why do you say that? He says, well, because they said they were going to give me a job offer, and now they want me to fill out an application. I said, well, that's common, the way you described the interview process for me, that you do the application afterwards, and then the offer comes to you. He says, yeah, but it feels really, really shady to me. I said, how do you mean it feels shady? He said, well, people I'm working with just told me that this other thing isn't going to, they're not doing it the right way or the way that I'm used to. And I shared with them, I said, well, oftentimes when you get hired through a contract service, you can have the chance that the company buys out the contract right away. And the question that I'm really trying to understand from his perspective is he doesn't value himself because the companies he's working for don't value him. So they're very, very isolated to those specific things, and it's really just trying to uncover that, to see where they're at. But my opinion is, when you look at context matters, he has experiences that tell him he's not valued. So then I got to say, well, you are valued. How do we get you to take a step forward and think maybe that from a business side, I get to deal with buying out contracts regularly. This is a normal part of my process, and then can inform, that person to say, don't take it so negatively just yet. Yes?
Hey, William, Tracy, I have the mic. A couple things I just wanted to ask you, but first I'm going to preface it by something that somebody said on one of our KataCoach phone calls the other day, which I told them we should put on a T-shirt and give out at KataCon, and it was, I'm a bit of an outsider here at my work, where he thought that way. So I just want to ask you if you think that you're standing in a room with 215 people who are probably the right people for the, you're kind of preaching to the choir. Mm-hmm. And so, I want to ask you that first. Do you think that most of these people would fit that profile? Because
No,
they showed up?
I do not.
Okay, let's talk about that. Tell me.
Yes, so there's a piece where I think people want to be more open than they really are. So we judge ourselves differently than others judge us. So I think the reality check is to ask your closest peers. So I may be open on 10 things, but very closed-minded on the next 3. And that is really what this is sharing. When we think about it in the work world, if I think about a specific problem we're dealing with, my approach isn't necessarily the right approach. It's just the one I think is right. So I think what you've got to be mindful of is the challenge or the goal still being sought after? And it may be just a different method. So for me, I'm aware of that bias to go push something, and then I step back and say, let me just get out of it, because the new thing may be created better than I've ever seen. And even if it's not, who cares? We can adjust later. And I think that's important for us to understand, because I hear the dogma thing coming out of Kata already, and it's like 10 years. Like, we got to slow down for a little bit and figure out where is that going to go, because if we're like the last 50 renditions of OpEx, we'll end up dead in 20 years just the same. So to me, it's being able to navigate those situations. But I heard it, obviously the Kata rules, find a coach, be a coach. That's the person you need to find. So when I went through the research, I didn't expect to find friends. I just expected to, at the point to get participants. And then I still engage people today. Talked to Michael Lombard, and he had such a good conversation with me, I couldn't use him for my research because he gave me all my answers. So you get these, I would say, team members that can certainly inform that practice. And it's very, very important for me to not set the assumption that we're on the far right in contextual relativity, because none of us are always there. What's that, Oscar? Few of us, so Oscar shared, few of us are ever there. And I agree with that statement. You may be there for a moment, but you regress. So the value in Kata is you keep going through this cycle every single day. So there's that link to conscientiousness, the orderliness of the world. And as Billy was shaking his head a few times over here, he seems like a great resource to reach out to at this point in terms of where it's going. Most of the room isn't informed by this type of research. So then it's saying, how do I find a coach that can help me with that process? And then go forward in your organizations. If you want to ask the personality question, and I know it wasn't one that you asked, Michael, but some may ask that question. There are already a litany of tests that evaluate personality, that are validated, that don't have any, or I should say, have been limited for bias, and then you can use that to inform your practice. And not surprisingly, the answers I shared here today are the answers we keep finding over and over and over in all of the psychological research about who performs the best in organizations. And I think specific to Kata, it's just really that marriage. So what I don't know at this point, and I wouldn't pretend to know, is how far do you go before it's a bad thing? Because too much openness isn't necessarily good. Too much conscientiousness is not a good thing. So I was reading an article last night, and I'll share this for the healthcare side. Suicide rates for doctors is extremely high. Doctors are highly conscientious. So then it leaves me the question, do you want these same team members taking on this additional work if mental health is at risk? So it's something that needs a lot more research than what I'm presenting today, but at least takes us to a next step to say, let's go ask a new research question. Anything else? Appreciate your time today, and I wanted to share what's coming up next, because I just like to do this. Michael Lombard's coming up, then Mike Rother, Dwayne Butcher, and a networking break, so please do come see me in the back when you get a chance. Thank you.